It started with a sound I hadn't heard in years, sliding through the bar like it had been waiting patiently for the exact second my guard was down, the kind of song that doesn't just play but arrives, carrying memory with it whether you want it or not. And the moment the first notes hit, something tightened behind my ribs before I even understood why. The bar was loud, packed with the familiar chaos of clinking glasses, overlapping conversations, laughter bouncing off dark wood and brick. Our friends crowded around us like always, but that song cut through everything with surgical precision, and I knew immediately it wasn't a coincidence, not a request pulled from a jukebox algorithm or a bartender's random mood, because nobody knew that song except two people in that room, and one of them was sitting right next to me. Years ago, on a road trip that felt like an escape from gravity, she'd played it for me somewhere between desert and dawn, her bare feet on the dashboard, my hand resting on her thigh while the world stretched endlessly forward, and she'd leaned over, kissed me slow, and said it felt like us, like movement and freedom and sex without urgency, desire without fear. And I'd believed her in that way you believe things when you're young enough to think shared moments can't be stolen. Hearing it now felt like someone had reached into my chest and turned a memory inside out, and before I could stop myself, I looked at her. She froze for half a second too long, the kind of pause that doesn't register unless you love someone enough to know their rhythms. And then she smiled, relaxed her shoulders, and turned toward the bar, her eyes meeting the bartender's in a way that didn't belong to strangers. It was quick, practiced, intimate, a look exchanged without words that said more than an explanation ever could, and I saw him smile back at her, not the polite smile of someone doing their job, but something warmer, something personal, something that made my stomach drop even as my face stayed calm. She leaned closer to me then, her fingers brushing my arm, familiar and grounding and confusing all at once, and said something about loving the song, about how funny it was that it came on tonight, her voice light, casual, rehearsed, and I nodded like I hadn't just watched a private moment unfold between my wife and another man. The bartender lingered longer than necessary when he brought her drink, his fingers grazing hers, his eyes dipping just slightly to her mouth before snapping back up. And there was sex in the air, not the crude kind, but the charged, suspended kind that lives in glances and proximity, and the knowledge of what could happen if nobody was watching closely enough. I watched everything after that, with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The way he anticipated her order before she spoke, the way she tilted her body toward the bar, even when she was laughing with our friends, the way he found excuses to hover near us, wiping an already clean surface, adjusting bottles that didn't need adjusting, always close enough to touch. I felt myself fading into the background of my own marriage, present but irrelevant, a familiar fixture that no longer required attention, and the humiliation of it burned quietly, not enough to cause a scene, just enough to stay. When the song ended, the bar noise rushed back in like air after a held breath, and nobody else noticed anything had changed, but I felt like I was standing on a cracked floor, pretending not to look down. She kissed my cheek when we left, warm and soft and affectionate, and for a moment desire flared because desire doesn't disappear just because betrayal has entered the room, but it was tainted now, layered with images I couldn't unsee, looks I couldn't reinterpret. That night, lying beside her while she slept, her body curved toward mine, familiar in every detail, I stared into the dark and replayed the moment again and again, the song, the look, the smile, the certainty in it. And I told myself I'd imagined it, that jealousy was inventing patterns, that love required trust even when it felt uncomfortable. And I decided that tomorrow I'd wake up and act like nothing had happened, even as the music kept playing in my head on an endless loop, refusing to fade. I didn't confront her, not because I lacked the courage, but because something inside me had shifted, a quiet instinct telling me that questions would only teach her how to lie better. So instead I watched, and the watching became its own kind of obsession, sharpening my senses in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days of desire, when every glance and breath felt loaded with possibility. We went back to the bar the following week with the same group of friends, the same loose laughter, the same shared plates and inside jokes, and I told myself I was being ridiculous until the bartender looked up the second we walked in, his eyes finding her with practiced ease, his mouth already forming a smile meant for someone he knew too well. She didn't suggest a table that night, not like she used to, not like she always had when she wanted to lean close to me, legs brushing, knees tangling beneath the wood. Instead, she said it might be fun to sit at the bar, just to change things up, her voice casual, playful, and I agreed because I wanted to see if the pattern would repeat itself when given space. The bartender was already reaching for a glass before she spoke, already pouring the drink she liked without asking, the one she claimed she only ordered when she was in a certain mood. And when he set it down in front of her, their fingers touched again, lingering just long enough to feel intentional. There was nothing overt, nothing that would make our friends raise an eyebrow, but beneath the surface it was electric, the kind of tension that doesn't need words to exist, that feeds on proximity and restraint, and I felt myself becoming a piece of furniture, present but unnecessary, a witness to a conversation happening on another frequency. She laughed at his jokes in a way that was softer, more intimate, her head tilting slightly, exposing her neck, and I remembered that exact gesture from our early years, remembered how it used to undo me, how it still did, even now, even as it made my stomach tighten with something close to grief. We started going more often after that, or maybe it just felt that way because I was paying attention, and I noticed how she'd suggest nights that coincided perfectly with his shifts, how she'd dress with a little more intention, not overtly sexy, but aware, the kind of outfit that hinted rather than announced, leaving room for imagination. She was still my wife, still slept beside me, still touched me in familiar ways, and the sex we had was good in the way long-term sex often is, practiced and intimate. But there were moments now when her mind seemed elsewhere, when her eyes closed a fraction longer, when I wondered whose hands she was imagining on her skin. The bartender anticipated everything, refilled her glass before it was empty, leaned in close to hear her over the music even when she wasn't speaking softly, his arm brushing hers, his presence constant, and I realized that the affair, whatever stage it was in, thrived on my silence, on the assumption that I was either blind or unwilling to see. I felt humiliated, not because I was being betrayed, but because I was being excluded from something happening in plain sight, made invisible by my own familiarity. I stopped trying to insert myself into the space between them, stopped forcing conversation, stopped competing for her attention, and the more I withdrew, the bolder they became, not reckless, but comfortable, as if the boundaries had been tested and found flexible. I caught him watching her mouth when she drank, the slow way her lips closed around the glass, and I felt a flash of something dark and possessive, a reminder that desire doesn't disappear just because trust erodes. It just changes shape. On the walk home one night, she slipped her hand into mine, squeezing, grounding herself, and told me she was happy, that she loved our life, and I believed that she believed it, even as the pattern continued to assemble itself in my mind, piece by piece, undeniable now. I didn't argue, didn't accuse, didn't pull away, because I understood something essential in that moment, something that settled into me with surprising calm. If she thought I wasn't paying attention, she would keep making mistakes, and I would let her, quietly, patiently, until the shape of the truth was complete. I learned quickly that confrontation would have ruined everything, not because it would have saved my marriage, but because it would have pushed them back into the shadows where imagination could still protect them. So instead, I did the opposite, and began to disappear in small, deliberate ways, the kind of disappearance that looks like comfort rather than suspicion. At the bar, I stopped sitting close to her, stopped leaning in to hear her over the music, stopped touching her knee under the counter, and I watched how easily the space I vacated was claimed by someone who had clearly been waiting for it. When I withdrew, the bartender grew bolder, not reckless, not obvious enough to invite questions, but relaxed in the way people become when they believe they are no longer being observed. He leaned closer to her now, his voice low, his forearm resting on the bar just inches from where her hand lay, and she responded instinctively, her body angling toward him, her laughter deepening, slowing, the kind of laugh that comes from the chest rather than the throat. I sat just far enough away to be irrelevant, nursing my drink, listening to conversations that didn't matter, watching everything that did. She touched him casually, a hand on his arm when he made her laugh, fingers brushing his wrist when he passed her a glass, gestures so light they could be explained away as friendly if anyone cared to explain them at all. And I realized that the affair relied on something more than secrecy. It relied on the assumption that I was harmless, predictable, the kind of husband who would never imagine his wife wanting someone else badly enough to risk everything. The humiliation of that assumption burned more than the betrayal itself. There were moments when desire tangled itself into the mess, when I caught the way she looked under the low bar lights, the way her mouth curved when she smiled, the way she crossed her legs and leaned back just enough to draw attention. And I hated that I still wanted her, that sex with her still lived in my body as memory and instinct even as my mind cataloged her betrayal. I watched the bartender notice the same things, his gaze flicking to her legs, her mouth, her neck, and I wondered how many times he'd imagined her without me in the picture, how often she'd let him. The more invisible I became, the more careless they grew, not touching openly, but stretching the rules, trusting that familiarity would shield them. I saw him slip her a napkin with something written on it and watched her fold it without looking, sliding it into her purse like muscle memory, and my chest tightened with the quiet certainty that this was no longer new, no longer thrilling in the way secrets usually are at the beginning. This was practiced, routine, comfortable, and that realization settled into me with a strange calm. At home, nothing changed on the surface, and that was perhaps the cruelest part. She still kissed me, still undressed with familiar ease, still let me pull her close at night, and the sex we had carried the same rhythm it always had, bodies that knew each other well. But there were moments when her breath caught in a way that didn't belong to me anymore, moments when her eyes closed and I wondered who she was seeing, whose hands she was feeling layered over mine. I didn't ask. I didn't accuse. I stored the questions away, letting them sharpen. By the third week of my silence, the bartender barely acknowledged me at all, his attention fixed comfortably on her, and I understood then that invisibility was the greatest gift I could give them, because it made them believe they were alone, even when they weren't. Sitting there, watching my wife laugh with another man while our friends talked around us, I felt something solidify inside me, a resolve that didn't need anger to fuel it, just patience. And I knew that whatever this was, it would end not with a confrontation, but with understanding, complete and irreversible. The idea came to me on a night when I realized he no longer saw me at all, not as a husband, not as a threat, barely even as a customer, and that invisibility felt like an invitation rather than an insult. So I decided to step back into focus on my own terms. I started small, ordering at the bar instead of waiting for him to come to our end, asking about the record spinning overhead, making a comment about how it sounded like an original pressing rather than a digital rip, watching his eyes light up with interest before he remembered himself. Music was his currency, his identity, and I paid an attention, the kind that feels harmless but feeds the ego all the same. He warmed quickly once he realized I wasn't competing with him, that I wasn't trying to reclaim space or assert anything territorial, and we talked about vinyl, about bands that never broke through, about the difference between songs that age and songs that rot, and I played the role carefully, the nostalgic guy who loved remembering rather than accusing. He leaned into it, enjoying being seen, enjoying the validation, and I could almost see the tension drain from his shoulders as he decided I wasn't someone he needed to watch. The irony of bonding over music while my marriage unraveled beneath the same soundtrack wasn't lost on me, but I swallowed it and smiled. My wife didn't notice at first, or if she did, she dismissed it as meaningless, a harmless overlap between two men who shared a taste she'd always considered incidental. She laughed when I mentioned his knowledge, teased me about making friends everywhere, and I watched her relax, watched the subtle recalibration as she decided the situation was safe again. That relaxation was everything, because people only make real mistakes when they feel secure, and security was something I was happy to provide. Over time, he started lingering after his shift when I was around, nursing a beer, talking louder, looser. The edge of flirtation in his voice when he talked about women who appreciated good music, who understood the thrill of being chosen. There was a sexual undercurrent to those conversations, not explicit, but present in the way he described desire as reward, attention as currency, and I listened without judgment, nodding, encouraging, letting him believe he was talking to someone who admired rather than assessed him. Every word he offered was a thread, and I let them accumulate without pulling yet. There were moments when the proximity made my skin crawl, when he leaned too close, laughing, clapping my shoulder, when I could smell the bar on him, alcohol and citrus and sweat, and I thought about his hands on my wife, imagined the familiarity, the confidence, the way desire strips away hesitation, but I kept my expression neutral, my role intact. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about clarity, about seeing the shape of things without distortion. My wife grew more affectionate during this time, mistaking my calm for forgiveness she hadn't earned, mistaking my patience for ignorance, and the sex between us took on a strange intensity, not passionate in the way reconciliation might be, but charged with something unspoken, something she seemed to need, and I allowed without comment. I held her, kissed her, let her believe in the version of me that wouldn't ask questions, and afterward, lying beside her, I thought about how easily people confuse silence with consent. By the end of the month, the bartender trusted me, confided in me, saw me as an ally, and I understood then that friendship, when misused, is one of the most effective weapons there is, because it lowers defenses without raising alarms. I had no illusions about what I was doing or why, and as I watched him laugh across the bar, comfortable and careless, I felt the quiet certainty that the story he was telling himself about control and secrecy was nearing its end, whether he knew it yet or not. It happened later than I expected, on a night when the bar smelled heavier than usual of spilled beer and citrus peel, when the music was louder and the edges of conversation blurred just enough to make people careless, and I knew the shift had finally tipped from implication into confession the moment he ordered a drink after closing and slid into the stool beside me like it was his right. He was loose, relaxed, riding that particular confidence that comes from being desired and undiscovered, and when he started talking, it wasn't to impress me so much as to hear himself say the things he believed made him powerful. We talked about music at first, about how some songs only work at the right volume, in the right room, with the right person listening, and he laughed as he said it, glancing down the bar where my wife stood with friends, her back to us, her hair falling the way he liked it to fall. There was hunger in that look, not desperate, but entitled, and when he turned back to me, his voice dropped, casual and conspiratorial, like we were sharing a joke rather than dismantling my life. He talked about regulars, about how loyalty came in different forms, about how some people tipped with more than cash, the words sliding out easily now, lubricated by alcohol and ego. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression open, encouraging, nodding as if this were just another story, another night. And when he laughed and said it was funny how married women were always the boldest, I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to fill it. He talked about secrecy like it was a sport, about the thrill of being chosen over stability, about sex that felt sharper because it had edges, because it wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't say her name, didn't need to, because every detail pointed toward her with brutal clarity, the timing, the gestures, the confidence with which he spoke. I slipped my phone onto the bar between us, screen dark, recording quietly, my hand resting near it as if by accident, and he didn't notice, too caught up in his own narrative, too sure of his control. He said some people came for the drinks but stayed for the connection, for the feeling of being seen in a way their partners had stopped seeing them. And when he said that, something inside me went cold, not with anger, but with understanding. This wasn't about sex alone, Not about attraction or boredom, but about power, about being chosen and choosing in return. Then, almost as an aside, he mentioned something that didn't fit, something that made my breath catch even as I kept my posture relaxed. He said the funny thing was how long some stories really were, how people assumed everything started where they first noticed it, and how wrong that assumption usually was. He took another drink and said some connections predated the places they were discovered, that sometimes bars were chosen, not stumbled into, and the words settled into me with a weight that felt almost physical. I asked a question then, gentle, curious, about whether that ever made things messy, about whether history complicated desire, and he shrugged, smiling, and said history was what made it better, made it feel earned. He talked about knowing someone longer than their spouse ever would, about shared memories that belonged only to them, and I realized in that moment that I wasn't listening to a brag so much as a confession layered with pride. The affair hadn't started here, hadn't grown accidentally out of proximity and late nights, and the bar itself was part of the design. When I finally left, the recording secure, my hands steady despite the storm inside me, I didn't feel triumphant or devastated, just focused. I kissed my wife goodnight later, felt the familiar warmth of her body, the practiced intimacy, and understood with brutal clarity that the life I thought I'd been living had been edited without my consent. Lying awake in the dark, the bartender's voice replaying softly through my headphones, I knew the shape of the truth was nearly complete, and that once fully seen, it would be impossible for any of us to pretend it had been accidental. The truth didn't arrive all at once, not as a single revelation, but as a series of small, brutal confirmations that stacked themselves into something impossible to ignore, each one stripping away another layer of the life I thought I understood. I listened to the recording again the next morning, alone in my car, parked 2 blocks away from my own house like I was afraid the walls might hear it, and the bartender's voice sounded different in daylight, less charming, more careless, every word heavy with implication. When he talked about history, about connections that predated discovery, something in me refused to let it remain abstract, and I started pulling at threads I'd ignored for years. I went back through old memories with a new lens, moments that had felt insignificant at the time now rearranging themselves into patterns that made my chest ache. A trip she'd taken alone years ago before we were married, framed as a spontaneous escape, a conference that ran long, a friend she never quite named clearly. At the time, I'd trusted her without effort, because trust had been easy then, because love had felt mutual and uncomplicated. Now those memories shifted, their edges sharpening, and I felt like I was discovering annotations scribbled into the margins of my own past. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions. Instead, I watched more closely than ever, listened when she talked, noted the casual references that slipped out when she felt safe. One night, she mentioned the bar and laughed about how funny it was that it had become our place, how familiar it felt from the beginning, and something in her tone caught, just slightly, like a misstep she hadn't meant to make. I realized then that the bar wasn't an accident or a convenience. It was a choice, selected with intention, a stage built on top of something that already existed. The song came back to me, the one from the road trip, and I finally understood what it had been. Not nostalgia, not romance, but a signal, a reminder wrapped in melody, a way of saying, remember who we were before anyone else mattered. It made my stomach turn to think of how many times I'd sat there, smiling, drinking, laughing with friends, unaware that the soundtrack of my marriage had been repurposed into something secret and shared between 2 people who weren't me. When I finally pieced it together, the full shape of it, the affair stopped feeling like a betrayal of the present and started feeling like an erasure of the past. This wasn't a mistake born of boredom or desire that had gotten out of hand. It was layered, deliberate, carried forward quietly while I built a life on top of it. I wondered how many moments she'd shared with me while holding something else just out of sight, how often sex between us had been followed by a text, a look, a memory that didn't include me at all. Strangely, Once the realization settled, anger didn't come first. What came was a cold, steady clarity, the kind that arrives when the last excuse collapses. I stopped questioning my instincts, stopped second-guessing my reactions, and accepted that the version of my marriage I'd believed in had never existed the way I thought it had. I was living inside a story that had been edited without my knowledge, scenes rearranged, meanings altered, and the editor had been sitting across from me every night, smiling, touching my hand. She sensed the shift in me, I think, because she grew softer, more affectionate, touching me more often, initiating sex with an urgency that felt almost pleading. And I responded, because desire doesn't obey logic, because bodies remember what minds are still processing. There was tension in it now, a strange electricity, as if she were trying to anchor herself to something she felt slipping. And I let her, holding her close, feeling the weight of what she didn't know I knew. By the time I lay awake beside her, her breathing slow and even, I understood something fundamental. The song hadn't exposed the affair. It had exposed the timeline, and with it, the depth of the lie. Whatever came next wouldn't be about catching her or punishing him, but about reclaiming my own narrative, because once you realize your past has been rewritten, you can't unsee it, and you can't go back to living inside someone else's version of the truth. Once the truth settled into place, once the past stopped shifting and hardened into something solid, planning felt less like revenge and more like architecture, careful and quiet, every piece measured so the structure would hold when the weight finally dropped. I suggested an anniversary gathering over dinner one night, my tone light, almost nostalgic, mentioning how we hadn't really celebrated properly in years, how it might be nice to bring a few close friends together, nothing loud or dramatic, just people who knew us, who'd watched our story unfold from the outside. I watched her face as I spoke, the brief flicker of surprise, followed by relief, then warmth, and finally something that looked dangerously close to gratitude. She leaned across the table and kissed me, slow and deliberate, her hand resting on my chest as if to reassure herself I was still there, still hers, and the intimacy of it stirred something complicated in me. Desire tangled with resolve in a way that made my pulse quicken. She interpreted my suggestion exactly the way I hoped she would, as a sign that whatever tension she'd sensed was dissolving, that my calm meant forgiveness she hadn't had to ask for, and over the next few days she softened into me, laughing more easily, touching me in passing, initiating sex with an eagerness that felt almost like relief. I responded, because refusing would have raised questions, and because part of me wanted to feel her one last time without illusion. While she planned menus and messaged friends, I worked quietly in parallel, testing the audio late at night with headphones on, trimming nothing, leaving the bartender's voice intact, confident, careless, each word a brick in the foundation of what was coming. I tested the timing obsessively, imagined the room, the way sound would carry, the moment silence would fall when understanding replaced confusion, and I made sure there would be no easy exit, no way to dismiss it as a joke or misunderstanding. This wasn't about humiliation for its own sake. It was about undeniability. I framed the evening as intimate, insisted on keeping the guest list small, people whose opinions mattered, whose presence would make the truth impossible to minimize. She agreed readily, even enthusiastically, mistaking control for safety, and I watched her move through the house in the days leading up to it, humming softly, playing music as she cooked, the same song from the bar appearing in a playlist she claimed was nostalgic. Each note felt like confirmation, like proof that she believed the past was still hers to curate. At night, lying beside her, I felt the tension between us thrum just beneath the surface, not hostile, not overt, but charged, as if we were both waiting for something unnamed to arrive. She held me closer than usual, her body warm and familiar, her breathing slowing only after she was sure I wasn't pulling away, and I wondered if she sensed the countdown ticking quietly between us, if some instinct was whispering that comfort built on a mission never lasts. I didn't give anything away, didn't change my rhythm, didn't withdraw or accuse, because the success of what I was building depended on her believing she was safe. The bartender texted once during that week, a casual message about a new record he thought I'd like, and I responded politely, thanked him, kept the tone friendly, neutral, reinforcing the version of myself he'd come to trust. The ease of that lie surprised me, how naturally it came after weeks of observation and restraint, and I understood then how easily people live double lives when the rewards feel worth the effort. As the day of the anniversary approached, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not satisfaction, not excitement, but the clarity that comes when a decision has been fully made and no longer needs revisiting. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't hopeful either. I was prepared. When she asked me what I was most looking forward to that night, I smiled and told her the truth, carefully framed, that I was excited to share a memory with the people who mattered most, and she laughed, squeezing my hand, unaware of how precise that statement really was. By the time the house was ready and the invitations confirmed, I knew there was no turning back, and strangely, that certainty felt lighter than all the weeks of watching and waiting. The story was already written. All that remained was to let it be heard. The house felt different once everyone arrived, heavier somehow, saturated with voices and laughter that bounced off the walls and filled the spaces where secrets had been quietly living for years. Candles flickered on the table, glasses clinked, coats were piled carelessly on the bed upstairs, and our friends moved through the rooms with the comfortable ease of people who believed they were stepping into a familiar story, one with a happy middle and an assumed future. My wife glowed in that environment, animated and warm, touching arms, laughing easily, slipping into the role she knew by heart, and more than once I caught her looking at me with something that felt like relief, as if this gathering confirmed that whatever she feared had passed. I watched her from across the room, cataloging small details with a calm that surprised me. The way her eyes lingered when someone praised us as a couple, the way she leaned into me when a hand rested at the small of her back, her body language quietly claiming me while the truth hovered just beneath the surface. There was an intimacy to it, not just between us but in the room itself, and for a moment I felt the strange pull of nostalgia, the temptation to freeze the night right there, before everything fractured. Desire stirred unexpectedly when she brushed past me in the kitchen, her hip catching mine, her fingers grazing my wrist, a reminder of how easy it would be to pretend. Dinner unfolded slowly, deliberately, the conversation drifting from shared memories to inside jokes, stories retold for the comfort of familiarity. At one point, someone asked how we'd met, and she answered smoothly, confidently, telling the version of the story that had always been acceptable, and I listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of the omission settle quietly. When dessert was cleared and the wine poured again, I stood and tapped my glass, smiling as I thanked everyone for coming, my voice steady enough that no one sensed the effort behind it. I told them I'd planned something special, a memory from our past that felt right to share on an anniversary, something that reminded me of how music had always threaded through our lives. My wife smiled at that, visibly relaxing, and I saw her glance briefly toward the speakers, as if already anticipating nostalgia. I pressed play. At first, there was confusion, the unfamiliar cadence of a voice cutting through the room, casual, confident, the sound of a man talking the way men do when they believe they're admired. A few people laughed uncertainly, assuming it was a joke, a story they didn't yet understand. But as the words continued, as the meaning sharpened, the room changed. The bartender's voice filled the space, bragging, unguarded, talking about married women, secrecy, sex framed as reward, and I watched the realization ripple outward, one face at a time, until it reached her. She froze. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a shout, but completely, as if the sound had pinned her in place. Her color drained, her eyes fixed on the speaker, her mouth opening once as if to speak, and then closing again. Silence spread like a held breath, the kind that makes every small movement feel amplified, and when the recording ended, no one spoke at all. The candles flickered. Someone cleared their throat and then thought better of it. I looked at her then, really looked, and felt a strange detachment settle in. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, but clarity. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to reinterpret, nothing to soften. The truth had entered the room fully formed, undeniable, and it sat between us with a weight that made denial impossible. She finally turned to me, her expression fractured, fear and calculation colliding, and whispered my name like it might anchor her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse or explain. I simply thanked our friends again, told them I was sorry for the surprise, and suggested we take a break. Chairs scraped softly as people stood, murmuring, eyes darting between us, and the party dissolved without drama, leaving behind the echo of what had been said and what could no longer be unsaid. When the door finally closed and the house fell quiet, she sank into a chair, her hands shaking, and I stood there, the last note of the recording still ringing in my ears, understanding that whatever came next would be built on the foundation of this moment, and that the story we'd been telling everyone else had finally reached the end of its careful performance. The quiet after everyone left had a texture to it, thick and oppressive, as if the house itself were waiting to hear how the truth would land now that there was no audience to manage. She sat there staring at the floor, hands clasped too tightly, breathing shallow and fast, and for a moment I thought she might cry, that the performance would finally crack into something raw and honest. Instead, she looked up at me with an expression that felt calculated, even in its fear, and I understood then that confession, if it came at all, would be strategic. She started with denial, softly, carefully, saying the recording didn't prove anything specific, that men exaggerated, that bartenders told stories to feel important, and I listened without interrupting, because I wanted to see how far she would take it. When that failed, when the silence I offered didn't turn into reassurance, she shifted tactics, her voice breaking just enough to sound real, telling me it had only been sex, meaningless, a mistake that didn't change how she felt about me. The word sex hung between us, stripped of intimacy, framed as something transactional and forgettable, and it hurt more than anger ever could. I asked her one question then, calmly, about how long she'd known him, and the pause that followed told me everything before she spoke. She hesitated, recalibrated, and finally admitted it hadn't started at the bar, that they'd known each other years ago, that it had been on and off, complicated, unfinished. Each word rewrote another piece of my past, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest with a dull finality. This wasn't a lapse. It was a continuation, a thread she'd never cut. The real fracture came later that night, not from her, but from him. My phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected, frantic and disjointed, asking if we could talk, insisting there'd been a misunderstanding, and against my better judgment, I answered. He talked too fast, tripping over his own words, trying to minimize what he'd said, trying to shift blame, and then, without realizing it, he gave himself away completely. He mentioned other women, other marriages, other arrangements, and when I asked how he knew my wife would understand, he laughed weakly and said she always did. That was the moment the second betrayal surfaced, sharp and undeniable. It wasn't just that she'd slept with him, it was that she'd helped him. She'd covered for him, warned him, laughed with him about discretion, enjoyed the power of being in on something that hurt other people. When I confronted her with that, with his words echoing through the room, she didn't deny it. She looked at me with something close to resentment and said it wasn't my business, that those women weren't my concern, and the cruelty of that statement landed harder than any confession could have. I saw her differently then, not as someone who'd been tempted or lonely or careless, but as someone who'd chosen secrecy as a kind of currency, who'd enjoyed the sense of superiority that came from knowing and not telling. The affair wasn't fueled by romance or dissatisfaction. It was fueled by control, by the quiet thrill of managing narratives, and I realized how little of that person I'd ever really known. The bartender unraveled quickly after that, sending messages, calling, alternating between apology and accusation, exposing himself with every attempt to salvage what he'd lost. By morning, the story had spread beyond our walls, carried by the people who'd been in that room, and the image he'd cultivated for himself collapsed under the weight of his own voice. She watched it happen with growing panic, realizing too late that the secrecy she'd valued so much offered no protection once the truth escaped. I didn't argue or demand explanations. I listened, observed, and let the final pieces fall into place. The betrayal had expanded beyond the boundaries of our marriage, revealing something deeper and uglier than infidelity. And as the night gave way to a pale, indifferent dawn, I understood that whatever grief I felt would be temporary, but the clarity would not be. The days that followed unfolded without drama, which surprised everyone but me, because once the truth had been spoken aloud, there was nothing left to escalate, only things to dismantle carefully. We spoke in low voices, briefly, practically, dividing the life we'd built with the efficiency of people who understood there was no version of this that returned us to what we had been. There were no accusations left to make, no apologies that meant anything, and I found that I didn't need her remorse to move forward, because clarity had replaced the need for validation. She packed a bag, paused as if expecting me to stop her, and when I didn't, she left with a look that suggested she'd finally realized how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath her. Word traveled quickly, faster than either of us could control, and I didn't try to manage it. Friends reached out cautiously, some apologetic for what they hadn't seen, others quietly angry on my behalf, and I answered only what was necessary, refusing to shape the narrative beyond what had already been revealed. The bartender disappeared from our orbit entirely, his confidence evaporating as the recording circulated, his reputation collapsing under the weight of his own voice, and I felt no satisfaction in it, only a distant acknowledgement that actions eventually find their echo. Whatever he'd imagined himself to be, whatever power he thought secrecy granted him, dissolved the moment it was exposed to light. The house grew quieter, emptier, and at first the silence pressed in on me, a reminder of habits and routines abruptly severed, but slowly it transformed into something breathable. I slept better than I had in months, my thoughts no longer looping endlessly through suspicion and doubt, and when desire surfaced, it was no longer tangled with betrayal, no longer compromised by images I hadn't asked to carry. I missed the familiarity of her body, the ease of shared history, but I didn't miss the version of myself who'd been shrinking to accommodate someone else's duplicity. Loss and relief coexisted, neither canceling the other out. One evening, weeks later, I sat alone with a glass of whiskey and played the song again, the same one that had cracked everything open, and for the first time since that night at the bar, it didn't hurt. The memory of the road trip returned, vivid and unaltered, but now it belonged solely to me, stripped of the meaning she and the bartender had tried to overwrite. I understood then that memories don't become lies just because someone else misuses them. They only lose their power when you surrender them. Listening to it there, alone, I felt something close to peace settle into me. Not triumph, not bitterness, but ownership. I didn't walk away angry or vindicated, and I didn't stay long enough to watch her regret unfold, because neither would have changed what mattered. What I carried with me was the knowledge that I'd seen the truth fully and chosen myself without theatrics, without apology. The music ended. The room fell quiet, and in that quiet, I recognized the sound of something beginning again, unremarkable and real, finally free of the lies that had once been set to a borrowed melody.